Welcome to our one last hurrah big ol' Q&A panel. We have everybody sitting on the stage and we have 3 mics. So there's going to be a bit of juggling, but not literal juggling. I checked, that's bad. So we're gonna kick things off with the questions that y'all opened and upvoted in the repo. The first one that we're going to go over, and I can't find it, of course now. Yes, push the button. Yeah, you too, Joel.
Wait. Oh.
It's on.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
yeah.
I can introduce the first one. So yeah,
Like
so
this?
I kind of looked through, and one that I'm personally interested in is how do you convince customers to use Elm in their product? So sort of from a consulting perspective, you're going out to someone and saying, we're going to use this experimental thing. Like, what do you say to them? That's not a story I've heard before, but it seems like people have done it successfully, so I'm curious to hear.
I'm just going to talk to pitching it to developers, but if you want to talk about customer experience.
Well, maybe Aussie should talk about this as a consultancy, but because I don't work at a consultancy. But I have talked a lot about this with my customers being the company that I work for, the corporate entity for which I'm employed. And I think that it's a very valid idea to talk about the risks that are involved with choosing something like Elm as your tech stack. Because when you're talking with people who have money that they're going to give to you to do something, you want them to be comfortable with the fact that that money is not going to just disappear into nothing because of your choice, right? So, and these people are typically very used to addressing things like analyzing risk associated with making some business choice. And so I find it productive to approach this conversation with a recognition that there is a risk involved with using this technology because of how new it is, but also express the fact that there's a lot of safety and benefit that comes from taking that risk. And you can say, when I'm done with this, in however much time passes and you need to come back and fix it or add on to it, it's going to be significantly easier and less expensive for you to expand upon this product and fix it in later times than if I do this other thing right now. So and then you could say it's totally up to you. Are you willing to take a little bit of risk to gain the benefit of much increased stability as far as productivity goes and security in the future? I think that's what I'd say. Do you want to talk about that?
Actually, I'd like to hear what are the risks that you're talking about.
Okay. So, and this is one of the things that we talked about a lot, is the size of the community is substantially smaller than something like the React community. And if you're a small company, you may not have the money to dedicate a number of people to making sure that that tool is, that the company's educated in that tool and that people are making tooling around Elm, for example. So that's a risk. There's also a risk that people will lose interest and that you'll find yourself writing CoffeeScript all of a sudden, things like that. So those are a couple of risks.
Okay.
The pitch you just made is very similar to the pitch that most other languages or frameworks do, right? They say there's a few risks, but if you use this framework or language, you'll have benefits in the future because it can be easily extended. What's so special about Elm that sets it apart from all of those others with a similar pitch?
I don't want to dominate the conversation too, so if anyone else wants to jump in, that's great.
Yeah, so I kind of have like a 1-minute pitch about Elm nowadays, but it boils down to 2 things. The one that Murphy already talked about, and then the fact that it will take about 2 weeks for a new developer to get inside a new or an existing JavaScript project. So that's also about the same amount of time that you will spend learning Elm. So it's like you will have to learn new stuff anyway when you get into an existing project. And it doesn't really matter if it's a new language or just the quirks in the current project that has been done with, say, Angular and some React, maybe.
I think we've kind of answered that question. Oh, did you have something, Jeff?
Yeah, just something short on that. I pitched Elm to my company. I work at Pivotal Tracker, and I actually sold it really hard. My first approach was just to say Elm as many times as possible until it was a thing. I think that worked, but if you want something more concrete, I realize that different people want to hear different things. For developers, some of the developers at least, all I had to say was, hey, do you like working in JavaScript? No? Well, you don't have to. And that convinced enough of them to go explore it enough and bring it to their clients. For like a project manager or product owner, just saying 0 runtime exceptions was a pretty big thing for them. And our Pivotal's kind of mission is just to make it easier and better and more manageable to make better software. And so I just showed how Elm's whole goal and design aligned with that and would help us be able to do that in the same way that Ruby did that for us a few years ago. And I think that that kind of touched at some people. So.
So actually, I have something to add to this conversation. So I also work at a consultancy company, but most of our clients aren't actually care about what type of technology that we use. They only care about they want to build something and what is the best tool to build this, and they rely on our expertise to choose the right technology for that. So I think that works very well because now we can just tell them, hey, yeah, we have. If you use Elm, then it's going to be more reliable. You won't have any runtime error, and it's easier to maintain, and that itself gonna sell it really well. And so for clients that actually have a technical requirement, then that's a lot harder to sell. But I think the takeaway for this is that if you have a client that doesn't really care about what technology stack they use, then it's a lot easier for you. So just you can try using Elm on that kind of project, and then make that as a success story, so that you have a stronger case in the future for client that doesn't want to use Elm. Like, hey, we have a very success story here, and then that will hopefully convince them to also use Elm for that project.
So I had one note about the worry about like how we're going to find Elm people, and so. I don't know how many folks are familiar with this idea of the Python paradox. Do we know if you've heard of this thing before? Okay, I thought, okay, in any case, it was this idea Python was coming out, and people thought it was cool, and they'd say, I want to use this on my project, but no one programs Python, so I can't use it. And what you find at the time of this writing was, it was harder to find Python programmers, but Python programmers were great. And they were eager to find jobs where they could work on that language. So it actually makes, the idea of the Python paradox is, even though there's no one to hire, it's actually easier to hire for that language. And so maybe some folks can speak to that.
So it's kind of like OkCupid. You don't actually want the maximum number of people to read your profile. You just want a few of the right people to read your profile?
I don't know how I can possibly follow that, but yeah, so just anecdotally, so before we switched to Elm, we had a lot of trouble hiring front-end people, and more specifically, so we hired me, and I was for a while the front-end team, and then after me there was like a 2-year drought where we couldn't find anyone to come work, and we were actually super early adopters of React. Like, we basically got into it like right when it was hot, so we had about as much going for us as we could on the JavaScript side, but we still just couldn't find anybody who was, like you said, like the sort of caliber developer that we want, that was also interested in working for us. Since we switched to Elm, like almost all of our senior front-end people have been like basically found out about the company because of Elm, because we are loud about our usage of Elm, so people are aware that we're using it, and they, when they like interviewed, they specifically cited like, I want to come work for you because Elm is awesome and you seem like you have a great team and education and all that. But so like, if you were to graph like before we adopted Elm and since we adopted Elm, just like our success at hiring, I mean, it's just like a complete joke. It's like, whoop. Like, I mean, the idea that it's made it harder for us to hire is like so far from like what's actually reality, it's comical. But I totally understand where the intuition would come from because, to be quite honest, I would not have guessed that it would be so dramatic. I would have been like, oh, well, maybe it's about equal, but it's not at all equal. It's just like a gigantic advantage. So that's been our experience.
So I'm gonna be a huge bummer and like talk about the flip side of attempting to sell Elm.
Perfect.
Sorry?
Perfect.
Yeah, just so there's like even perspective, because at my previous company, I tried to get them to use Elm, and I like totally fell on my face. So I left so I could use Elm. Go Elm. So basically the point I want to make is that as wonderful as we know Elm to be, selling new things to people is hard because people are people with feelings and they're not like sorting algorithms. So that's just like something you really need to be prepared for, even though you might have like prepared your pitch in your head. Some people just don't like new things, and you're going to run into cases where you try to convince a client or an internal team to use Elm, and it's just not going to work out. So
Yeah, and one thing I kind of hope people will think about is this project, it exists now, but it's going to exist in 10 years and 20 years from now as well. So you might be on a team that's not open to it today, but the right move strategically may be to just be like, okay, cool, let's come back to this in a year, and maybe people feel different about the community, maybe there's this library that someone was worried about. And so rather than sort of getting frustrated at people who are risk averse in a particular way, try to either just circle back or think of sort of ways to get them closer to what you're thinking about. So this is something that's sort of been, we've seen a lot with people using Redux. Like this happened at Prezi. There was a team using React and Redux and Immutable JS and Flow. And at some point they were like, what, why are we doing this? Like the guy's like right there. And why, so yeah, so what I'm getting at though is, you know, going through intermediate steps like this or circling back isn't giving up. This is part of a process of sort of like getting people to make a transition. Because I mean, like I was saying before, it's not just a technical artifact. There's a group of people who need to understand this technology and sort of feel comfortable with it.
Let me plug something real quick. The recent How to Use Elm at Work blog post is like, yeah, it's not just take all your React stack and flip it. It's like replace a little bit at a time. Like, go read that. It's really good.
Yeah,
I gotta
so
plug the oven.
the downside of making a transition like this is it's like it's a lot slower than in your imagination. You know, you picture you show up, there's this amazing thing, and then everyone's like, I don't know, yeah, and like that's sort of just the reality of it. And if you have the right expectations about that, I don't think it feels as like crazy as sort of going up against this entrenched view. I wanted to ask the question. There was one question. How do you use Elm and work well with designers? I think I'm not getting it exactly right, but discuss.
So, Tessa, you want to take this?
So I guess I'm kind of confused by the question since like how you work with designers is kind of like they're people. Just no, I'm kidding. Designers are amazing, and like good design is the reason why Elm is awesome, because it's thought out and planned and keeps in mind its users, which is us. So I would like to have more clarity on the question.
I've got it pulled up here.
So my interpretation was like there are a decent number of companies where there's someone who writes the CSS and then they give it to you, or like, yeah, or they write HTML and then they give it to you, and then it's just like, how do I? Yeah, that's another way. The Photoshop one's sort of an easier one in the sense that like it just was a like PSD file, and it's like, well, what was I going to do with it either way? It's just a picture. But yeah.
I've got the question here. It was, how can we effectively work with designers? Given that we typically work with HTML as Elm lists and designers typically don't know Elm, how can we work together on web page designs?
Okay, cool. I'm glad somebody asked this because this is my favorite question. Designers are smart and have a hard job. They can learn it. Like, seriously. I mean, like, we've seen this happen. Like, I actually think whenever like I hear this meme of like designers need JSX, I'm like, what designers are you working with? Like, do you know how insanely difficult it is to like do a good job visually designing something? Like, you're saying that they can learn CSS, like CSS, right? but like, instead of angle brackets, we have a list, and that's like too far. I mean, so specifically our designer, Stacy, we now have 2 designers, but at the time it was just Stacy, and like she just like made a PR against our Elm code, and like not only did she like never any of us ever tell her how it worked, she just was like not even thinking to ask. She was just like, oh, okay, got it. Here, this will do what I need. I just don't. I think that basically the presumption of the question, I think, is that like the designers can't handle that. But I think that my reaction to that is to sort of reevaluate. I think that designers can handle it.
So I asked the question. The problem is you're taking away all their tools that they're used to.
That's it. So you're taking away all the tools that they're used to. That's a great point. So as far as like editing raw HTML, that's a fair point. That is something that like there aren't tools for editing straight like Elm HTML. But for going from, if you're making a mockup from scratch, just in straight HTML, then you can translate that directly into Elm from the get-go because there's an online tool that will do that for you. I think it's called HTML to Elm. Like if you Google that, then it'll just bring it up. We've used that plenty of times. So you just paste in the HTML and then it converts it to Elm. So that works at the beginning as far as editing HTML like on the fly. Granted, I don't know how frequently other shops need to do that, like need to use an editor in particular to edit raw HTML files. If that's a common use case, then fair point. That's going to be harder in Elm.
Yeah, if so, like, tell us about it, and we'll see what we can do. Because there are folks who have ideas about Pete, who we talked about this a lot. Oh yeah. So, oh yeah, okay, yeah. So if you're around, you can watch that. But it's these ideas. Pete said there's a talk at Strange Loop coming up about what is it called? Sketch and Sketch, written in Elm, and it's a way of you can write code and it has some output, but then you can modify that visual output and it will in turn modify the code that produced it. And so some exploration along these lines. So there may not be that tool you're looking for, but if you let us know the specific use case, we can work on making that happen and just understanding better. So yeah.
I was going to add to that, less about the tools, but kind of about the process of working with designers. We recently were designing loading states and error states, and our designers went and made something nice, and then we sat and talked for a while and realized that, well, what if it's being loaded and it hasn't come yet? Should it have a spinner or whatever? And what if it's been loaded but it's an error? And all of these cases that we had to go back and kind of redo the designs. Watching some of the talks, like Asim mentioned, that nice fetch data type where it has not requested and loading found, not found. Thinking of that as the model beforehand and sort of working with designers, the same things that we need for the model are the same things that we need designs for. And that would have been a cool thing that we could talk with designers, and they are smart, they understand that. And you mentioned, Richard mentioned the error states, breaking that up into its own type. And if we have this text that has an undo, it also has the command to bring back. We literally designed that exactly. And the type that we need to come up with needs to match the visuals for it. So we're kind of doing the same thing, although it's visual versus code. Same problem to solve, and that's a conversation that you can have across team.
I'm trying to figure out what question should be next, but there's one that it's just like a PSA. How can you load common Elm code once there are multiple Elm apps on the same page? If you use Elm make and just list all the files, it'll put them into a single JavaScript file, and it's smaller. So do that.
We had a technical question about Tessa's talk that I thought might be interesting. It was what data structure would you recommend for binary trees sent over ports specifically?
I think I'd kind of push back against sending complex data structures through ports. And if you want a data structure that easily allows you to add things, check to see if things are in it, take things out, you should really probably think about just using a set.
It's also kind of a trick question. I wonder if the asker was just asking, like, when can ports send union types through? And the answer is like, you know, that's something that's on this long list of things, and it's unclear when it will bubble up. I don't know if this is a good one to address here, but I like the question, the top one there. Someone asked for Aussie, what things should not be a component?
Yeah, I also like the question. That's a really nice question to ask. In short, I would say most things should not be a component. The core thing is that if the thing that you're building is completely separated from any other state that you have in the application, then it really makes sense to make that into a component or a triplet. So try to think of how separated the state is in your state tree. That's what is really the key point there.
So I think this question is interesting because we're sort of working through it in the documentation at the moment. So I can give some sort of early ideas of what that documentation is going to look like in the end. But so one thing I think it's important to think about is if someone comes to Elm and says, I want to structure my application with objects. I want everything to be an object, and this sidebar will be an object, and my main list of things will be an object, and each entry will be an object. People would just say, oh, that's a bad idea. You know, this is not an object-oriented language. You want to do things in a functional way. Now, if someone says, I want to structure everything in terms of components, these components will have hidden local state, will have getters and setters for them, they'll have their own private and public methods. And I just think that's a really powerful way of structuring applications. For some reason, people are like, oh yeah, that seems hard. Like, let's consider that deeply. And to me, it's sort of it's trying to do the same thing. So it's not to say like what should or shouldn't be a component. It's just like that idea is the idea of an object, but someone gave it a cool new name, so it doesn't sound like, you know, programming object-oriented Java in the browser. So one sort of that's not constructive advice though. That's just sort of saying, oh, that doesn't seem to be sort of the right mindset. And so what we're starting to develop is a way of talking about how to think about it in the right way. So one part of that we started talking about is think about functions as the key part of reuse, right? So when you want to break out some logic, always reach for a function. So if your update's getting too crazy, make a helper function. If your view's getting too crazy, make a helper function. Now, the thing that I think you should be thinking about instead of components is sort of what Richard was talking about. How do we model data in a nice way? And so when I would make something that's a component, what I would mean by that is I'm making a module that has a data structure and all the functions in it are built around that data structure and maintaining some invariance. So I maybe want to have a zip list as part of this thing. There are certain ways to access it. And from the outside, I just use those external functions and I'm able to manipulate it. But it's more about that data structure and keeping it in order than about grouping the functions or anything in particular, right? So you may have some functions that need to look inside and respect these invariants. So those go in the module. But that doesn't mean we're making a component. It's just we're collecting data and functions that need to know about each other, and we're exposing them to the outside world such that the implementation details are gone. And that's sort of like, I don't know what the one-page short example doc is going to be that sort of gets at that idea, but that's kind of where I want people to be thinking on this.
So something I've noticed, like, because we did a lot of React before Elm, and so we did a lot of like components, because like React has a thing called React components, like that's very well defined. But one of the things that I noticed compared to Elm is that in Elm, basically, I'm kind of like, I only want to isolate state when I have a really good reason to. Like I have a really like compelling need, and honestly, quite often as a sort of last resort. Whereas in React, it's just so easy to reach for that it almost feels arbitrary when you should or should not do it. So it's like, does this go in the props or the state? I mean, there's like a lot of arguments back and forth as to where it should go, because it's sort of so easy to do it either way. Whereas in Elm, it's sort of like, oh, if you want to isolate state, you have to go way out of your way to do that. And so by default, you just don't do that. Or at least I don't do that. It seems like it's pretty easy to arrive at Elm and be used to that familiar, like, oh, object-oriented, like, local isolated state is just like super cheap to just grab it. It's like equivalent to not having it. And so you just sort of like want to have access to it even when you don't necessarily need it. And so something that I've noticed is somebody on Twitter recently, I think it was Michael Jackson, one of the authors of React Router, commented something like, he said like, encapsulating local state, I'm going to misquote him, but like something like encapsulating local state is sort of like the challenge of building UIs. Or like the biggest challenge. And I was like, I don't actually feel that way. Like for me, it doesn't, like writing Elm programs, I don't feel like that's the biggest challenge. In fact, I usually feel like that's just sort of like, oh, that's something that I only do when I need it. And it seems pretty clear when I need it, because if I don't do it, then my program won't run, or I won't be able to reuse it. And I think that's because when you have it so easily at hand, it becomes a big challenge to decide when to use it or not. Whereas when it's not near at hand, it's just not as big of a decision. What I said is, for me, it seems like data modeling is like one of the biggest challenges, like deciding like how to organize the state that's in my application. Hence the talk.
I'm wondering if there's a difference here, if we can draw the lines in different places that we're talking about in Elm. Sometimes you want to isolate the state in order to maintain invariance, as opposed to drawing lines on the screen and saying we have to isolate this 1 by 2 inch square of real estate. It's not so visual, it's actual data model.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And actually, just to piggyback on that, I actually did this to myself in Dreamwriter. So like, I haven't upgraded Dreamwriter since like Elm 0.15, partially because I've been busy, but mainly, like I'm not even kidding, mainly because I discovered that there was this technique through which I could make my Elm code look more like my React code. And so I was like, oh, cool, I can make the sidebar its own component, and I can like separate it out and give it its own model view and update, and I can give the header its own thing. And so I did this, and I refactored it to do that, and then I hated the code base and didn't want to work on it anymore. And, and like basically haven't touched it since then. But I know that when I do go back to it eventually, probably like elm.19 or something, then like the first thing I'm gonna do is just scrap all of that and just like undo all of that damage that I did to my own code base. Because yeah, like drawing the lines around your data model based on like what's on the screen just is not the right thing to do in Elm. It just makes your life worse, in my experience.
Yeah, one last thing. Like on some level, it's weird to think that the way your data is shaped should also match the way your designer says that the user should look at the data. Like it's kind of a weird concept. Okay, so there's this other, yeah, yeah, something. Oh, sounds like a good idea. We should name it. Okay, so there's a question that I guess I tried to address this in the talk this morning, but it's how can beginners contribute to Elm without writing Haskell? And so one of the sort of use case they have in mind was like improving elmling.org, which it's written the Haskell, or sorry, the server is written in Haskell, and if you tried to look at the site this morning, you'll see that maybe that's not the right technical choice for a variety of reasons besides accessibility. But I think and part of it is just like people wanting to get feedback on these kinds of pull requests. So one aspect is we're sort of slowly building that community of people who can give that feedback and who are excited about it, right? Like if we were Go, Google would just say, here's your $1 million a year, and you have a developer relations person, and we pay them this large amount of money, and they go to all the conferences, and they do all this kind of stuff. And then everyone would be like, oh, this is working well. But I think that's sort of a weird way to build a community, and like I don't expect that's what happens in languages like Python and Ruby and Elm. So that group of people is developing. Another thing is to sort of be, like if you want to make some changes to elmlang.org but you're not telling anybody about it, things have already gone wrong. Like Haskell's not the first step, right? So it might be, I'm interested in doing this kind of thing. Are people interested in that? Like, and if it's like, I'm interested in rewriting this content, it's like, well, I get a lot, like so people want to help with the guide. And it's like, that's my book. Like, right? Like, I don't know, like I don't know if I want to co-author, but if someone gives me like a new chapter, like that's your chapter. That's something you post as a resource for people. And that's actually a great way to sort of get onto these kinds of projects, because people in the community are going to see that and say, actually, this is an amazing resource. And you're not coming to a project as an unknown entity, right? You might be confident in your own skills and you might be great, but if no one knows that, it would be irresponsible to just take your word for it, right? Someone shows up and says, I'm amazing at compilers, I rewrote the parser. It'd be reasonable to say, is this the first time writing parsers? I'm going to read through this code. Like, what makes that investment like a good idea? So I hope that kind of helps answer the question. Maybe not. I don't know. But a big part is just like talk to people about it. People can help out. There are a decent number of people in this community who know Haskell, and for the website in particular, it needs help. And what I'd like to move towards in the long term is the try page. That part will be a Haskell server that actually runs things, and the rest we can just serve statically. So one way to sort of, if you're doing stuff of changing the Elm of elmlang.org, is you can just hand compile with Elm make the different pages and just avoid all the Haskell anything. And so that means you can change Elm logic and do a decent amount of stuff.
I'm coming at this from a bit of a different perspective here. Sorry. Oh, we had somebody.
I was just going to say that was my question. Thank you for answering it. I heard your episode of the change log where you were talking about possibly having things in the compiler that were like hitting someone over the head, like, hey, you did this wrong the first time. Like, why did you do it wrong again? And so it was more, I was trying to get at that beginners getting feedback or giving feedback as they're going through your guide, like, hey, this was a stumbling block for me. So that the same mistakes wouldn't be repeated over and over again and people wouldn't get discouraged.
Okay, so the clarification is people are reading through these resources and might be sort of stumbling over the same thing again. How do we improve those particular pieces? Yeah, I'm repeating for the recording. But yeah, so yeah, there's an ability to give comments on, there's a repo for the guide. But it's something that's quite hard to do, right? I think the best way for the documentation that I've written, the best way I've seen to really like make it a lot better is just to sit down with a brand new person and just like look over their shoulder. So I got a chance to do this. I visited formerly Hacker School, now Recurse Center. And someone was just like, hey, I'm going to use Elm today. And they just went through the basics. And I sort of saw everything they ran into. And I was just like, oh, yeah, that's dumb. It shouldn't be like that. Oh, that's another. And I think there's no substitute for just watching someone. Because it's really hard as you're going through that experience to even see the things that, right, you find something confusing, but you're like, oh, this language is just confusing. And I look at it and I'm like, oh, they're going to be searching for like 15 minutes. And like, it should just be right here. So that's how I approach it. I don't have a sort of generalized way to receive that feedback and respond promptly. I mean, I can receive the feedback and in aggregate respond at some point, but it's really hard to do something more fine-grained than that, unless people are on Slack, right? So that's sort of how I would go, is like, just talk to people in the community to sort of bring up these concerns.
I feel like you could also combine your first and second answers, which is if you stumble on something, your first contributions to the community could be, this is a thing I stumbled on.
Yeah, that's actually a great point, like writing about that kind of stuff, yeah. Better answer. I don't know what other questions. All right, let me look real quick.
Oh, I remember one off the top of my head. Somebody asked about runtime exceptions in production. Also, they did it by asking how many ELM runtime exceptions we've gotten in production. I don't know what ELM is, but as far as Elm goes, so we have not, we've been using it in production for a little over a year and a half. We still have not gotten any runtime exceptions from our Elm code. And that's like, just to be clear on what that means, that's like, we get lots of runtime exceptions from our JavaScript, well, it's CoffeeScript code, but like our non-Elm front-end stuff, and we have the service called Rollbar that tracks them. And so far, to date, every single time we've gotten one of those, the fix has been not changing Elm code. That has not happened yet. But we do get errors. So I think the question was phrased in terms of errors. The errors we get are just bread and butter, like business logic errors. Like we make mistakes, we invert booleans, like it's equal instead of not equal, stuff like that, and then we have to fix them. It's just that like they don't crash, right? So the end user experience is not like the page stopped working, more that it didn't work the way that they expected or maybe the way that we wanted it to work. So Elm is awesome, but it cannot fix all things. The compiler can prevent things from crashing, but it can't stop things from like we just made a mistake.
Did any of you have a question you specifically wanted to answer? Since we're kind of lulled. Okay, cool. All right.
A lot of people have been asking about Elm native UI, so I'm gonna try and answer it real quick. So
Yeah, I'm curious too, but we should also coordinate about it.
Yeah. This was exactly my point. Yeah. I'm going to talk with Evan today about what kind of changes I will need to do to the compiler and the core, because those things need to be in place for an unspecified type of program to exist. So that's something I haven't figured out.
I suspect the thing you need is part of what makes 18 work, so I think we'll see. I didn't want to bring this question up because I didn't know what you were thinking, but essentially the answer is like we should talk about this, and I think it'll be good. We'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, but there's a lot of work to be done, so don't get too excited yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the question is about effect managers. This was something that came out with 0.17 that lets you do stuff like WebSockets in a nicer way. Essentially, it's a way to have some layer between you and the server that does some of the annoying resource management, so you don't have to have that come into your Elm application. And the question is, how stable is that part of the language? There was a question as well from the list of, right now you're not able to publish that kind of package on the package website. Will that restriction change? So I'd say that it's stable-ish, right? That's probably one of the nothing will fundamentally change there, but there are some things around like initializing but also turning off. So one of the things that I'm thinking about in debugger is I want to switch from this program to this other program. If they have effect managers running, how do I do that transition in a smooth way such that things will keep going? And that's sort of part of what makes swapping of code difficult. And so it may be that there are sort of weird technical things that sort of require tweaks there. And this is a big part of why it's not possible to publish these packages, right? So it's something that I think will be helpful for certain sort of very core, not core, but sort of libraries that people shouldn't be writing. Like there shouldn't be 100 effect managers. There should be like, there's one for this backend, there's one for this other, and that's kind of the end of the story. So part of it is, I always try to be conservative in choices like this, and this was something where like we can have an explosion of hundreds of these, but let's just not take that route. right? Like, let's get it right before we open it up and sort of understand if it does get open, what are our goals with that process. So I've heard of folks using it like within their company to do interesting stuff. I think that's reasonable. I wouldn't go too crazy with it, but at the same time, I don't think it's particularly risky. I just am not sure it's a good idea. So hopefully that gives some.
Okay, I had a question. This question is for Evan and for the library and package maintainers and authors specifically. And the question is, how can we make you feel appreciated? How can we say thank you? What do you like? Brownies? Postcards?
You don't have to do anything extra.
The answer is French toast.
But yeah, no, it's just I appreciate the question, thank you. But I just hope people will sort of, whether you agree with the choices or not, appreciate that like folks are working really hard on it, and when people are struggling with something, like that sucks, right? Like I want this to be a really good experience for people. So when you're frustrated with something, just try to be empathetic and know that like I want it to be great as well. And sort of, you don't need to convince me with sort of emotional arguments, right? Like I get the technical part, and I know that like it sucks, but if it's like it sucks and you suck, and it's actually a sort of like a generational thing with your family, it's like. No one says that, but just try to, I'm doing my best, so.
One more note, just because I wanted to say this earlier, but it didn't occur to me. But something that is super awesome about this what's going on right here is that like this is the ground floor. This is the first ever elm-conf. So like everybody in this room is a part of the ground floor of this thing. Like this is it. We're here. It's happening, and like it's only going to get bigger from here. And I am so stoked about that. And I hope that everybody here is comparably stoked because this is a big deal. We're really doing something here. This is awesome.
And on that note, I think we're just about out of time. So thank you, everybody, for coming. There are food trucks somewhere around here. Check your email. There's a party at the City Museum tonight. Buses leave here pretty regularly from the front of Union Station. Thank you for coming. See you next year.